Okay, so, uh, yeah, adding the filioque is, as we've said, definitely something that's true. I mean, no doubt whatsoever that that is a true doctrine being expressed. In fact, that's the only possible explanation of the Holy Trinity. But it was not a good idea to add it when it was added, because it provides now a pretext for the schismatics to go into schism, or those who want to go into schism to actually go into schism. Photius closed his circular by applying to the Catholic priests the names of ministers of Antichrist and public corrupters. The indignation awakened by his first acts of violence only served to call forth fresh outbreaks from the bold schismatic. So there should be one word, outbreaks. The sentence of excommunication issued by Pope Nicholas I against the intruder had caused a great sensation in Constantinople, and many of the faithful refused to communicate with the schismatic patriarch, as well they should. He was never legitimate to begin with, in fact. So Photius visited all such demonstrations with the punishment due to rebellion and sedition, whereas he is the one actually, is the actual rebel, the actual intruder. The Catholic bishops who dared to oppose him were deposed and banished to distant cities. Patriarch Ignatius, still on the list of proscription, saw a price set on his head. Photius persecutes anybody who opposes him, in essence. At this time, it's again the Emperor Louis I. He had bestowed upon him and his false council the titles of Imperator, Caesar, and Augustus, regardless of the claims so loudly put forth by the Byzantine Chancery since the time of Charlemagne against the usurpation, such was their term of the Frankish kings. Remember, the emperors of the East are still claiming the entire Roman Empire, East and West. As we've seen, they're not doing a thing to try to defend the West, not done a thing against the inroads of barbarian tribes anyplace. Obviously, that's the reason why Charlemagne was crowned emperor in the year 800, which is, notice that's well over half a century prior to the point that we're looking at right now. That was Christmas Day of the year 800. We're in the 860s at this point. And they've still, they're the only ones who have provided any protection to the church, any semblance of civilization in the West at all, has been the Holy Roman Empire since then. So, that meaning either the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne or what succeeded it after him, which was not the same thing in terms of its power. Institutionally the same, but not in terms of what it was able to accomplish. So, notice how extremely low character Photius is. We've already seen that to some extent, but now he's trying to use flattery against the Holy Roman Emperor to try to get him to go along with the program. Those are all titles. Imperator, Caesar, Augustus, obviously those are all titles belonging to the Roman emperors. Imperator was actually, that's a military title. It means a commander. You might know that in ancient Rome, there were kings for a time who, for whatever reason, were hated by the Romans and who were eventually thrown out by the Romans. And so after that they adopted a republican system of government. And the emperors became effectively kings, obviously. There have been few monarchs on earth that have been more, monarchical than the Roman emperors were, but even so, they never actually adopted the title of king. They had the power of kings, there's no question about that whatsoever. In fact, they were worshipped as gods, but they never had the title. For whatever reason, Rex was a dirty word in ancient Rome. It's not entirely clear why they hated it so much, other than the fact that they hated the kings that they once had. But they never adopted the title. The very word emperor indeed comes from imperator, which is a military commander. So, just a note on that. He's giving to the Holy Roman Emperor, whose claims the Eastern emperors, the Greek emperors, the Byzantine emperors have always denied. He's granting him now the titles those titles to the Western emperor in order to try to butter him up. It's a form of flattery. So Basil, the Emperor Basil, possessed himself of the Byzantine throne, to which he restored its long-lost dignity, or at least to some extent. The administration of the empire was reorganized. Constantinople and the great cities of the empire were adorned by the erection of churches, hospitals, and educational institutions. Should be a period there. 2 days after his accession, Basil removed Photius from the patriarchal see as a disturber of the public peace, as well he should. St. Ignatius was recalled, and the schism seemed extinct, but this was only a momentary pause in the career of Photius. The tidings of this temporary restoration had not yet reached Nicholas I. He wrote to the bishops of Gaul, then in council at Troyes, to warn them against the schismatic attempts of Photius. Of all the troubles which weigh upon our pontificate, the condition of the East is that which most grieves our heart. The Emperor Michael III has plunged his empire into a schism because of our refusal to sanction the irregular election of the intruded patriarch Photius. So it goes on and talking about the accusations that are leveled against the Holy See. They make it a crime to teach the Catholic doctrine of the procession of the Holy Ghost from the Father and the Son. They accuse us of condemning marriage because we enjoin celibacy on our clergy, which actually, to be clear, was always the ideal as far as the church was concerned with regard to the state of the clergy, celibacy, which has always been the general rule. I think the clergy should be unmarried for obvious reasons. And the only reason why there were married clergy were ever permitted in the East, and that was really just a toleration, was because the constant danger that there always was that the East would go into schism. That's a constant danger. And the church can make certain concessions along such lines, and the church has indeed made such concessions. It's all for the good of souls. Remember that. That's the ultimate purpose that all of the laws of the church serve is the good of souls. Sometimes a law that in general might be very much apt to serving the good of souls, as definitely is the laws, all laws of clerical celibacy. Those most definitely do provide for the good of souls. Sometimes setting that aside in certain cases for certain groups of people might itself aid the good of souls in particular instances, in some places among certain groups. So just think about it on the one hand, how much good that has done for souls that priests not have wives or children of their own to have to worry about. They can devote themselves completely to the care of souls who are committed to them, to their care. Those are in a sense, the children that they have to take care of, the souls of everyone in their parishes or whatever place it is they're supposed to be working. Right? That would be impossible to devote oneself to that completely while having a family of your own to take care of. So it's for excellent. I mean, among other reasons, that's just one of them. There are other reasons as well, which we're not going to go into right now. And it's always been the ideal in the mind of the church. And it's something that is so closely, in fact, associated with the priesthood that even to consider a married priest is something jarring. Just think about that. Just imagine meeting, say maybe at least in the past, there aren't really many, if any at all, left now, but just imagine meeting in the past a priest of some Eastern rite who is Catholic in union with the Holy See and functioning with the approval of the Holy See and everything. But imagine meeting a married priest. There's something repugnant about that. Even okay, it's not intrinsically evil. It's just there's something that's not right about that. Everything about the priesthood obviously says sacrifice. The most important function of the priesthood is to offer the sacrifice of the Mass. In a sense, the sacrifice is at the very center of the priest's life. And so all the rest of his life should also proclaim attachment to sacrifice, such as giving up the pleasures of marriage and the joys of family life and so forth, everything associated with that. Because, among other reasons, that means that the priest can focus his full attention on the good of souls, rather than providing for a family. Not that there's anything wrong with providing for a family, it's just that that's of an undeniably lower order than it is to provide for the eternal welfare of souls. There's just no question about that. That's even de fide, actually, that a state of celibacy observed for a motive of virtue is more noble, is a greater thing, is a higher state than is the state of marriage. Even though the state of marriage, legitimate marriage, is a good thing in itself, still, it's contained in divine revelation and explicitly defined by the church that celibacy is in itself, observed for a motive of virtue, is a greater thing than even a good Catholic marriage. So, that's obviously absurd to say that the church condemns marriage by enjoining celibacy upon the clergy. Nobody's forced to enter the clergy, the clerical state. Some might be unduly pressured at sometimes. That's an abuse that sometimes does arise. But ultimately, nobody can ever be forced to accept the priesthood. Nobody can be forced into it. No one can undergo a valid ordination without his consenting to it. So in that sense, nobody can be forced into the clergy. So everybody, up until the reception of subdiaconate, even those who actually are clerics already, have received maybe tonsure, some of them the minor orders, some or all of them, has not yet given up the right to marry until that final step in the ceremony of the subdiaconate. That is the point of no return. All right, so they dare to assert that by removing the seat of the empire to Constantinople, the emperor has also transferred with it the primacy of the Roman Church and the prerogatives of honor and apostolic supremacy, which is completely absurd. Emperors have no authority to do that, and that's really all there is to it. Photius has even assumed the title of universal patriarch, and we've seen the Holy See repeatedly condemning that abuse. As it is impossible to convene you all in Rome to take measures against these bold attempts, we earnestly exhort you to meet in provincial councils, to examine the complaints and claims of the Eastern Church, that the unanimous voice of the West may crush this rising calumny. So, that's Pope Nicholas I, and who said that not having been informed of the fact that Photius had in fact been ejected, the intruder had been ejected, and a better emperor had come into power. Word traveled slowly at the time. Nowadays, we're used to, as soon as something momentous happens, within minutes or even seconds of knowing about it. In the past, it could take days, weeks, months, potentially, for word to travel. About the fastest it could travel was how quickly a messenger could sail or ride a horse or even walk. That was about as fast as word could travel. All right, so the churches of Gaul and Germany, thus addressed by the Holy Pontiff, had for the past 10 years been the theater of scandalous disputes, while imperial dissipation, the corruption of an adulterous minister, and the ambition of an intruded prelate had plunged the East into a sea of misery. The guilty passion of a Frankish prince had destroyed the peace of the West. So there's a lot of turmoil at this time. In 856, Lothar II, king of Lorraine, a year after his union with Tutberga, became madly enamored of Waldrada, sister of Gunther, Archbishop of Cologne. Notice they still have these barbarous-sounding names. Those don't sound like current-day French names, that's for sure. Anyway, keep in mind, though, that the Franks were a Germanic tribe, actually. And you could even actually see that in different parts of France. Definitely people in different say subsections of the French nation are definitely descended from different stocks. There are some more Germanic stocks that they're descended from the Franks. There are some more Roman-looking ones, and so forth. So it's France, as we know it as a nation, is still very much developing. Notice we're still referring to Gaul, whereas it's the baptism of Clovis that centuries in the past by this point that's considered to be the founding of France. That's considered to be the birth of the French nation. Even so, they're still referring to it as Gaul, and still definitely there are some barbarous elements left in some places. There you have this a prince still acting like a barbarian. Maybe not many elements, but in this instance. So the time had passed when a Frankish king, we have to take this very loosely, could tie or break the conjugal bond at will. Objectively, that was never possible. What is being said here is that it's now recognized the sanctity of the marriage bond, especially as a sacrament, even as a natural contract. And some marriages are not actually sacraments, valid marriages between two unbaptized persons, for example. That could be a true marriage, but it's not a sacrament. It could not possibly be because unbaptized persons are incapable of receiving a sacrament. But they can still get married in a purely natural contract of marriage. So, the Church, by insisting upon the indissolubility of the marriage tie, besides maintaining the respect due to the sanctity of a sacrament of divine institution, secure the clarity of individuals, the peace of the domestic circle, the regular transmission of inheritance, the dignity of woman, union among brothers, all the bonds and duties of family, without which nations soon become degraded, the light of civilization pales and gradually becomes extinct, witness Mohammedanism. Or we could say, witness the current state of the modern world. Remember that the family is the basic building block of civilization, really. Not the individual, the family. And this by divine will, by divine ordinance. Is that the case? And without there being a legitimate, a valid marriage to begin with, there cannot be a family, properly so called. In cases of people living in concubinage, it's not a family, that's just people living together and offspring under the same roof. That's not a family, properly so called. And indeed, the church insists upon the indissolubility of the marriage bond. There are certain cases in which it can be dissolved, very, very, very few instances, according to the Pauline privilege or the Patron privilege, which we're not going to enter into now. But definitely a validly contracted and consummated Christian marriage, which is to say the sacrament of matrimony, a validly contracted and consummated sacrament of matrimony is completely indissoluble by anything other than death. And that's what we're talking about here primarily. And it is the church, and really the church alone, that has always insisted on that, on the indissolubility of that. And indeed, it's not actually the strongest argument for that marriage is indissoluble is that it is an image of the union that exists between Christ and his church. That could never be dissolved, so also the marriage we've described could never be dissolved either. At least not while both parties are still alive. Impossible. And in the past, popes have, when asked to pronounce such bonds invalid or dissolved or anything like that, have repeatedly asserted their inability to do so. That is something that the Roman pontiff, the sovereign pontiff, the vicar of Christ on earth himself, cannot do. And something not even he can dissolve. And true popes have always stood by that, 100%. And notice here, in talking about the church and the very high standards that has for matrimony, not only in insisting upon its indissolubility, but also the correct its teachings on the correct ordering of the family, does indeed secure all the things that our author mentions here. And that includes, yes, notice the dignity of woman, as to say, raising up the wife and mother from the state of slavery in which she really was in the ancient pagan world. It really was a state of slavery, raising her up from that to the position of, one might say, is queen of the home, who's definitely has to be subordinated to the king of the home, by which I mean the husband and father, obviously. But definitely still, even in that position, still necessarily a subordinate position in a correctly ordered home, still raised up from that position of slavery and that paganism had for the wife and mother. Or the idea, there was no sense in the ancient pagan world of that a man has to be faithful to his wife. Sure, they had an idea that a wife could be unfaithful to her husband and should be punished for that, but there was no sense that a man had to be faithful to his wife. And she was seen effectively as her husband's property, more or less. So maybe something like an animal, the way that the man owns an animal. Something along those lines. If not exactly that. Obviously, the church condemns that notion. That conjugal fidelity goes both ways. That it is very much a contract. Marriage is very definitely a contract. Yes, it's a contract that Christ raised to the dignity of a sacrament, but it is definitely a contract. And in a contract, there is a meeting of the minds. That is, to define it very simply, that's what a contract is. Two people agree on something. You give me this and I give you that. And this holds true of not only official legal documents that have a bold heading of contract at the top, but any kind of an agreement that you make with somebody is, in general terms, a contract. So, take any kind of agreement that you have with somebody. You do this for me, I do that for you. That is, in a sense, a contract. In a moral sense. You are truly obliged to keep up your end of it. So marriage is a contract. There's a certain give and take, and that's why marriages fall apart, because one party might be giving, it might be giving insufficiently or taking too much, or maybe both at the same time. And so things become imbalanced, and somebody gets miserable and angry, and then it turns to war and falls apart. Falls apart in the sense that they can't keep it working anymore. The marriage bond remains there, but falls apart in the sense of causing dysfunction to the point that maybe in some cases they stop living together. So it is definitely a contract. What's interesting to note is that today, obviously, it's just taken very lightly. You've seen in many cases there's not even being something indissoluble. But notice also that feminism essentially seeks to reduce women in general back to a state of slavery in a different way from the form in which it existed in ancient paganism, but in this time of neo-paganism, which we talked about it, the fact that this is definitely an age of neo-paganism. It's in a different form, but it really is paganism again. In the sense that, remember, paganism starts as a worship of nature. In ancient paganism, they gave personifications to those forces of nature, built idols, and gave them names, told stories about them, and so on and so forth. That was the paganism. They started as the worship of nature. That was the paganism of the ancient times. Today, people just worship the earth as the earth. So it's even more nonsensical. But it also includes, it really is a return of paganism in every respect, with a different in certain ways, but once you really start to look at it, realize it is essentially very much the same thing. And that includes reducing women back to the state of slavery, but in a different way, not just by saying that she's a slave, but by telling them that, implying in many ways, without saying it. It's amazing how many ways in which it's implied. Once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. It's implied at every turn without being said that what men do is better in every way. And that any woman who doesn't want to do that, who wants to stay at home and be the queen of the home that we described, that have that noble position and actually take care of the children in the home, have her full-time job, as it were, to be that, and taking care of the home itself, that any woman who wants to do that is inferior. That very notion is just spit upon constantly and seen as something, that's held up as being slavery. Whereas what they really want is that the woman be enslaved and sent to go to dress like men, for one thing, and then to do jobs that men really should be doing out in the workplace. So it's amazing how that message is very strongly delivered, very definitely heard and acted upon, without being perceived for what it's even really saying. But that's what feminism is. And another way in which it enslaves women is by obviously encouraging them to dress horribly. Not only a sense of dressing like men, in which they become like bad parodies of men. Obviously, they look ridiculous when they try to wear the same work uniforms that men wear. They look ridiculous, typically. And they're definitely not capable of doing the same work that men do. As a general rule, there might be some exceptions, obviously, but as a general rule, no. Not only in that sense, but also just encourages them to dress with extreme immodesty many times. And in that way, that also sends the message that they are slaves to men's passions, that they exist just to satisfy the sexual appetites of men. So in every way, feminism is just a re-enslavement of women, while telling them, constantly branding itself as an empowerment. Whereas it's really doing is stripping them of the dignity and the authority that they have as queen of the home, and re-enslaving them in every sense. As far as making them work, in a sexual sense, every sense. Re-enslaving. That's what it actually is. And once you realize that, you see all of the ways in which that's true. And all of the ways in which that manifests itself. So it's very simple. Anybody who rejects the indissolubility of marriage and the church's teachings on marriage, generally speaking, ends up destroying civilization. Is committed to it. That's it. That's everything that's happening now. It's constant attacks on the family, the attacks on the wife and mother in the ways that we described, but also constant attacks on the authority of the husband and father. Any man who actually tries to be a man and to require the obedience of his wife and children, which he has every right to do in every legitimate matter, is characterized as a control freak and someone who is an absolute tyrant. He might be requiring the most basic things, but that's how it's going to be characterized typically. And that's obviously tearing down the authority of the husband and father as well. So, and you see that everywhere. It's everywhere in popular culture. You see it at every turn. It's everywhere. That also is everywhere. And so obviously you see here that it's a systematized attack on marriage, which is to attack the family, which is to attack the basic building block of civilization. For the purpose, in our times, the agenda is to get the world ready for the reign of the Antichrist. A time which will be a situation in which the Antichrist and his minions will be able to reach into the lives of every individual and control them to the utmost extent possible. And communism works towards that end constantly. Communism, socialism, wants there to be no other entity in between the state and the individual. So the state controls everything. It's certainly in a communist system, that's how it is. Just the state and the individual, nothing in between. At least nothing that is not part of the state in between. So the state controls absolutely every aspect of every life of every individual. Well, the aspect of every life of every individual. So that's that is the model of the reign of the Antichrist will follow, certainly. Okay, so the church obviously insists very much on marriage and the indissolubility of it. There are other arguments that prove the indissolubility of marriage, but the strongest one is that it is an image of the union that exists between Christ and his church. Okay, the immense services thus rendered to modern nations by the papacy are not sufficiently understood. That's true. The services in every respect of the church to the human race, most of all with regard to its temporal welfare, obviously, but even just for its eternal welfare, obviously, but also even just temporal welfare. That also has not been sufficiently, or it's been forgotten anyway. I mean, there may have been a time during the Middle Ages when that was recognized, but that's been forgotten. Certainly, most people don't care about the most important aspects of it, generally speaking, the eternal welfare, but even the temporal welfare, most have failed to recognize that. Right, but for the unyielding perseverance of the sovereign pontiffs, the barbarian elements reigning in the midst of European society during the 9th and 10th centuries, so there are still some, as we pointed out, would have triumphed over the most sacred moral principles, and the world, buried in the mire of vice, would never have reached the high degree of civilization of which we are so proud, but yet so far from grateful, and the vestiges of which are the reason why people still flood to Western Europe today from all over the world for reasons of tourism. Is to see really what's left of the influence of the faith in Western Europe. Yeah, in some cases, most obviously and directly, to see all the churches in Rome, for example. But also just to go see other cities in Western Europe, which would never have been built up, even the ones that might not be conspicuous for churches. The reason that their civilization existed to build nice cities at all in times past, which is what everybody goes to see, is because of the civilizing influence of the faith. That's the reason why there's so much tourism there, is because of the influence of the faith. Whether or not those who go there to see it realize that or not. Right, so blinded by an adulterous passion and determined to have it legalized by the Holy See at any cost, Lothair had recourse to a shameless deceit. He brought against the Empress an infamous charge capable of securing the dissolution of their marriage, according to the laws of the Church. So in other words, some accusation that, if true, would have meant that the marriage was invalid, and that could have resulted in an annulment, which is what an annulment is, to be clear. It's not the dissolution of a marriage bond, it's the legal declaration that a marriage which was legally recognized as valid was not actually valid. So you see, at every turn, you see it's a principle on which the thesis is founded, definitely, that it's possible for something to be recognized as true in the legal order without being true in the factual order, for lack of a better term. Not to say that legal order is fake or that it's not a fact that the legal order exists or anything like that, but there can be a discrepancy between what the law sees and what the actual nature of the situation is. And so it can happen that there be a marriage legally established, but that didn't actually take place. The church sees a marriage, the laws of the church see a marriage, but due to some defect, there wasn't actually one. And an annulment is to make it so that the legal order has caught up with the order of fact. Now, okay, there actually wasn't a marriage. That's what that is. The Novus Ordo has given annulments essentially the reputation of Catholic divorce and remarriage. But that's not what it is. Not in reality. In the Novus Ordo, maybe. Not in reality. So Tutberga availed herself of the justification then accredited by popular superstition, the judgment of God by the sword. So he said that that's a superstition, a kind of tempting God. But for whatever reason, it was continued to be used at this point, which was an abuse. The champion chosen to defend her honor came forth unhurt from the combat. In the conformity with the ruling custom, Lothair was forced to give back to Tutberga the rank of queen and spouse, it should be. But he could not give back a heart whose affection was all centered on another object. The apparent reconciliation was but short-lived. Lothair banished Tutberga from the royal palace in 859 and openly lived with Valdrada, so that's just still the adultery. Nicholas I did not hesitate an instant between the wronged and powerless victim and the crowned oppressor. The bishops of Gaul and Germany received a pontifical decree joining them to meet in council at Metz to cite Lothair and to pronounce a canonical sentence against him. Rodewald, the faithless bishop of Porto, was returning from his legation in Constantinople, where he had betrayed his trust, unfortunately a fairly common phenomenon. The Pope, still ignorant of his defection, sent him, together with John, Bishop of Ficolo, to preside in his name at the council, which was opened in the month of June of 863. All the prelates of Lothair's kingdom were present, except for the Bishop of Utrecht. It's a place that will become famous later on for bad reasons. By unlimited largesses and honors, Lothair had disposed the leading prelates far more favorably than he could have done by any process of law or canonical jurisprudence. So he's essentially bribing them in various ways to be on his side. Even the legates yielded to these disgraceful arguments. So, Rodewald of Porto proved as unworthy of his high mission at Metz as he had been at Constantinople, and his shameful example was followed by his colleague. The last council of Aix-la-Chapelle was confirmed, the marriage of Tutberga declared null, and the law and the union of Valdrada acknowledged as lawful. All of that, will be clear, can be itself reversed by the Holy See. No ecclesiastical proceedings are worth anything if the Pope disapproves of them, as we'll see. Will definitely happen, no question here whatsoever. So adultery was momentarily triumphant. Gunther, Valdrada's brother and Archbishop of Cologne, and Tutgald, Bishop of Trier, the two leading spirits in the work of iniquity, were deputed by the Council of Metz to accompany the legates to Rome and present the scandalous decision to the sovereign pontiff. Nicholas I was, perhaps of all the popes, well, it's probably not, we couldn't say that at this point, but he was certainly impervious to the miserable calculations of human respect, and to sagacity in unraveling the most skillfully concerted plots was equaled by his courage in the defense of injured innocence. So, on their arrival, these legates from the legates of iniquity, I guess, found all the Italian bishops convoked by the Pope to annul the acts of the Council of Metz. So the Pope is saying that counts for nothing. So Gunther and Tutgald were brought before the assembled prelates, and Nicholas received them with imposing dignity. When the renegade bishops timidly presented the decrees of Metz, signed by their own hands, with a request that he give them his apostolic sanction, the Pope only replied, "Withdraw, the council will call you when your presence is needed." So that must have been, just imagine the tenor of that. "Get out of here, we'll call you when we need you. Because we're going to destroy you, or at least destroy what you've done." Within a few days, they were summoned to hear the condemnation, no surprise there, of their Council of Metz, and as they persisted in maintaining its lawful authority, they were both deposed from the episcopate. And deposed truly. I'll use that. You see that term used a lot with regard to legitimate patriarchs of Constantinople. It's legally meaning nothing. The only thing that could mean in those cases is that it's unable to actually be in the right place and exercise its authority. Here, this is a true deposition, a true being stripped of all ecclesiastical standing. The same punishment was inflicted upon the faithless legates. Rodoald was already under the weight of the excommunication uttered against him while on his way to France for his disgraceful conduct at Constantinople. Okay, we'll continue with that next time. So this is all a very good picture of how real popes deal with situations like this. Photius et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen, subtuum presidium confugimus sanctare genitrix, nostros peccationes et despicias in necessitatibus, sera periculis cunctis libera nos semper vigorios et benedicta. Amen. Photius et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.